that when you have political power, that power will be used in ways that are unlikely to be corralled, contained, and so forth in a way that we might regard as, say, consistent with the rule of law. Instead, what happens is that those with influence fairly predictably get what they want, and others are disadvantaged as a result.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades, my name is Harrison Griffiths and I'm Communications Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today, I want to ask, can free markets be anti-capitalist? To answer, I'm joined today by Professor Gary Chartier, Associate Dean of La Sierra University Business School and the co-editor of the book Markets, Not Capitalism. Gary, thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure to be.
Most people regard free markets and capitalism as synonymous. Why do you disagree?
So it seems to me that we can, of course, spend a lot of time and energy arguing about words and definitions, but I think it's just important to recognize the degree to which, as my awesome friend Roderick Long has highlighted, the word capitalism in our context, our intellectual and cultural context, is a kind of anti-concept. It means, it's used to mean something like the free market system we have now. But the problem is that what we have now is a set of economic arrangements persistently and predictably distorted by cronyism and state intervention in ways that make it very hard to regard that system as a genuine market order. And so, because we then try, when using the word when using the word capitalism, to put these two ideas together, the idea of a market system and the idea of what we have now, the end result is that we end up either selling markets short by equating a genuine open market order with what we have now, or we end up pretending that what we have now is a more genuinely open market order than we actually have. So I think that's really the most important reason for being very skeptical about the use of the word capitalism to describe what I think those of us who are enthusiastically pro-market would like to see.
And in societies that are considered to be relatively market-based and liberal and capitalist, you and sort of people who are on the left and supportive of markets talk about the level of government cronyism in favor of entrenched market incumbents. Just how pervasive is that type of what many would call crony capitalism?
So it's obviously hard to assign an exact figure, but I think it just becomes increasingly clear when we inspect any major sector of the economy how much involvement there really is on the part of the state, whether that is, let's say, in the context of construction. Think about the way in which zoning and land use rules and building codes unavoidably tip the balance in favor of well-established incumbent players who can afford to meet the costs associated with adhering to those rules, or whether we're thinking about the tech sector, in which a great deal of wealth is dependent on the maintenance of intellectual property rules by the state. I think just pick a sector and it becomes very easy to highlight the level of intervention very often in that sector. Think about, and I hesitate in all of these cases to pronounce confidently about what's going on in other parts of the world, but certainly, in the U.S., it seems clear that tariffs and subsidies play an enormous role in supporting the kind of big agri sector and keeping out imports, agricultural imports from elsewhere in the world, and so forth. So I think it's unsurprising, right, that when you have political power, that power will be used in ways that are unlikely to be corralled, contained, and so forth in a way that we might regard as, say, consistent with the rule of law. Instead, what happens is that those with influence fairly predictably get what they want, and others are disadvantaged as a result. So, it seems to me that this is not limited to a single sector or a single instance by any stretch of the imagination. Instead, it's a kind of predictable result of having an entity like the modern state with the ability to kind of intervene willy-nilly.
You talked about trade and tariffs there as it pertains to big agriculture, but you also see advocacy for protectionism both within a country's borders and, more importantly, outside the country's borders when it comes to groups that are traditionally associated with the left, like trade unions, for example. And they're not the only ones. We have seen over the last 15 years or so, particularly since the 2008 financial crash, that there has been a lot of anger on the left that's directed towards, ostensibly, large incumbents like big tech, like big pharma. And the solutions from the mainstream on the left-wing politics across the West have been very state-centric. Why do you think it is that your view, the very pro-free market, anti-government left, why do you not think that's been more widely adopted? Why are they still turning to the state, who are the root cause of so many of these problems, and why we have a sort of class of producers at the top? Why are they turning to them for assistance rather than trying to take power away from the state and decentralize it across the economy through the free market?
Yeah, that's an absolutely brilliant question. And of course relates not just to recent developments, but to, ones that have taken place over, the last couple of centuries at least. It seems to me that people very much like the thought of being able to specify an outcome and make a decision that they believe will achieve that outcome. One of the frustrating things, I think, for a lot of people about a market order is precisely that it's decentralized, that it's experimental, that it doesn't involve a kind of predefined set of goals that are clearly then achievable by fiat. And I think people find that frustrating, and I think often counterintuitive, right? Because there's the perception that, well, in my own life, if I want to achieve something, I need to set a goal and then act accordingly. And there's the failure to recognize that in large-scale social settings, that's just not a viable approach. I also think, of course, that people turn to state action to address the kinds of difficulties that you're talking about because they have, been repeatedly told, again, back to our first exchange, that we have a market order. And so if we have these problems, the problems must be the fault of that market order. And because they're not necessarily always discerning the level to which level of state intervention, the level of cronyism that's involved, then I think it becomes really easy to blame the market for developments that really reflect much more the kind of deeply problematic interplay between influential market actors and the political system. Further, of course, and I guess more cynically, it's obviously in the interest of politicians to encourage the belief that they can offer solutions, right? If they can convince people, and they may well believe this themselves, it may well be crucial to their own sense of self-worth, that they can address the problems, then of course people will look to them for solutions and will return them to office and so forth. So I think it's a combination of factors, but at least those. Probably there are others I haven't thought of.
Something I want to pick up on from that answer was your view about people having the perception that they are in a market economy, when in fact those of us on the more radical pro-market side would argue that that's not quite an accurate picture. How can we balance so the competing interests of convincing people that the market actually has been stymied in several ways that impede its ability to solve some of the problems that they care about, but B, also using the empirical evidence of, in particular, the last 40 or 50 years to talk up the virtues of markets. So we might have, for example, criticism about the way that free trade has been handled over the last 40, 50 years as it exploded to prominence. We might say, well, it's managed trade. There's too much corporatism and crony capitalism involved in trade deals between countries, for example. But we don't want to then say, and therefore it hasn't been fruitful at all. We do want to sort of have our cake and eat it in that sense, say, well, yes, freer trade between countries and free commerce has been an unambiguous good in terms of eliminating global poverty and increasing mobility between countries. But at the same time, markets need to go further. Imagine what we could do if the government was even less involved with international trade. How do you think we can balance those two things?
Yeah, you're an exceptionally good communicator, and I think the way you've put the matter leaves very little to be considered or addressed here. I mean, I think it's obviously logically perfectly possible to say things have gone much better than they would have gone had we had a thoroughly statist order, and at the same time the state has continued to muck about with things in sometimes very, very disastrous ways. The difficulty, clearly, as is implicit in your question, is in helping people to see that those are both claims that can be made, that those are perfectly compatible claims. I'm not sure that beyond that, there's much to be said at the 40,000 foot level. I presume that what's needed is case studies which show how a given area, has in fact been hamstrung by state action, or a given sector has taken off but might have done better. I mean, I think there's fairly careful historical and economic analysis that has to be done in particular cases to make that clear to people. It's one thing to make the point in the abstract, which seems exactly right. It's another thing to tease apart the relevant causal factors, and I'm not sure there's a way to do that without very much getting into the weeds.
Yeah, and what we've covered so far, there won't be much disagreement between pro-market leftists and people who identify on the right who are pro-market, but delving into those points of disagreement between the likes of yourselves, who very much identify with the left, and the majority of the movement probably who identify with the right. In part 6 of Markets Not Capitalism, there is a section titled "Free the Markets, Eat the Rich." You, those of you on the free market left, actively believe that less government, or no government even, and a freed market will actively promote equality. Can you explain a little bit why that is? Because it's a criticism from many on the statist left of free markets that they promote inequality, and a lot of people within the free market movement are fully prepared to say things like economic equality are necessary and even sort of virtuous. They're an outcome of a process where different people with different abilities come together, do different things, create wealth together, and come out unequally, and that's okay. How would free markets promote that type of equality?
Yeah, so I think obviously equality and inequality are big umbrella terms, and we have to drill down to think more carefully about what we have in mind. It seems to me that So it was a piece I wrote some years ago at op-ed length, just called "What's Wrong with Inequality," in which I tried to think a bit about this. And what I suggest there is that there are two aspects of inequality that ought to trouble us. And we ought to, and exactly what the contribution each of these makes to current social conditions is, of course, a more complex matter, but there are at least these two aspects in play. So the first of these is inequality that results directly from, in one way or another, rigging of the system. And once we believe that the system gets rigged in various ways, it should hardly be surprising that the rigging doesn't work in a random way, right? It's reasonable to expect that it's going to tend to work on behalf of those with influence in the political process, or on the political process. So to the extent that that happens, and the kinds of ways that we talked about earlier, with the various kinds of state secured privileges, again, pick an industry and we can talk about specific examples. That's going to tend to funnel money toward those who enjoy those state secured privileges. Then the second kind of inequality that ought to trouble us is inequality that results from the use of the sort of influence that results from the first kind of inequality to further further influence the political process. And again, I think we can see, if I've already got a better economic position because I've got these privileges of one sort or another that have funneled money to my sector, my firm, to me, then it seems to me it becomes easy for me to try in one way or another to influence the political process in ways that will further reinforce my position. So, I mean, this becomes a little complicated because of the various ways in which, money either does or doesn't ultimately influence politics. But I think it would be wildly unlikely that sometimes, at least, people weren't able to make use of the resources they gained as a result of state secured privilege to obtain more privileges. So I think it's that kind of systemic concern that I would want to highlight. I certainly understand the point that you've noted might be made by some people, and with regard to various sorts of inequalities. And I don't think that the standard view of the sorts of kind of left libertarians, individualist anarchists in my kind of district of the movement, the point wouldn't be somehow those inequalities all kind of magically get eliminated, but that there's, first of all, just the sort of conceptual point that inequalities related to state secured privilege in the way that I've highlighted would get eliminated, and then the kind of empirical conjecture that those are significant in affecting how the actual socioeconomic arrangements we encounter work. So as long as those unjust inequalities are eliminated, I think we can be open-minded about just what the empirical impact will be, but it certainly will be the elimination. Certainly the elimination of those injustices is important on its own. And then we can, I guess, see exactly how that might have further effects.
And as far as the modern discourse is concerned, it is of course true that most people who identify as on the left or as socialist are hostile to markets, and most people who are not hostile to markets do identify on the right and as capitalists. And for whatever reason, people might dispute the semantics of those terms, but those movements have, as a matter of fact, developed in the way they have to create that fissure within the modern discourse. Why do you think it is that the left side of politics that used to be very well aligned with liberals. Bastiat himself, of course, sat on the left side of the French National Assembly. When did we get divorced? When did liberalism have more of a home on the right than the left? Is that the fault of liberals? Is that the fault of leftists? If so, why and how?
It's a really great question. And it seems to me that, the story's complex, and I won't be able to tell all of it. Some of it certainly has to do with the emergence of people like, the progressives in the US or the Fabians in Britain, who kind of start out in one way or another with connections to the liberals, but think that, what we really need now is to empower experts like ourselves to really make a difference in an increasingly out of control and chaotic economy. And it's, I think often people who started out with liberal values and liberal commitments, who thought that nonetheless, the anarchy of production, as Marx said, needed in one way or another to be tamed, because they saw an industrial order that just seemed to them, utterly chaotic. And so, you had a significant number of people shifting to in those kinds of groups, who shifting toward increasingly statist positions in the first part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th. And then it seems to me the people who were radical liberals, who were radically pro-market, found themselves in a minority among self-described liberals, and found themselves in a position in which the only folks who seemed to be at all sympathetic to their position were the conservatives, were the self-identified folks on the right. And so, even though, it seems to me in the 19th century, you definitely had pro-market, pro-free trade folks who would have absolutely thought of themselves as unequivocally, on the left side of the political spectrum. They did find themselves then encountering an increasingly paternalistic conservatism on the one hand, and an increasingly paternalistic, so-called new liberalism on the other. They're in a minority, and the right turns out to be, for some of them at least, a kind of perhaps unfortunate, but from their point of view, maybe inescapable home. We'd have to talk more about that, but it seems to me it's that kind of transition that's important here.
When we reach out to people as a movement, we tend to reach to the center right, and people with no political opinions at all. But however exactly resources should be allocated, I think it is important to try and reach out wherever we can to the left and center left as well. And when people on the left and center left talk to me about this, I advise reading some of the old American anarchists like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner to see where there are areas of commonality. In the modern day, Markets Not Capitalism, co-edited by yourself and Charles Johnson, and also Don Lavoie, the Austrian economist from George Mason University in the 70s and 80s. Is there anybody else more contemporary that you would point to and recommend for people on the left or centre left who are sort of flirting with a more liberal free market outlook?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think one thing that's really important to emphasize is that as we think about how to communicate and with whom to communicate, it seems to me we need to emphasize the relationship between authentically and indeed radically liberal values, as they have to do with economics, and other dimensions of people's political outlooks. I think that one real complication that we've had certainly in the U.S. context has been that the people who have favored haltingly and to limited degrees, and perhaps primarily in terms of rhetoric, have favored markets, have often at the same time been people who've been I'll try to find appropriately kind of just neutral ways of characterizing them, but socially conservative and often let's just say enthusiasts about the use of military power. And so I think for me, one thing that's been very important has been to try to highlight the connections between openness to social experimentation, openness to peace, and so forth on the part of liberals, not just as a kind of historical accident, but as a direct reflection of the same underlying commitments that make liberals pro-market in ways that I've hoped would be at least interesting to people on the left. I don't think I'm, concocting those connections at all. I think it's just important to recognize that liberalism is a package of ideas that really are interconnected in integral and non-arbitrary ways that ought to be interesting because of the appeal of those other kinds of ideas to folks on the left, even if they're not sure about markets. So that I think one important approach, right, is to say, let's look at other things that you value and see how a plausible way of making sense of and articulating those turns out to fit very nicely with an approach that's pro-market. So that's the first sort of, again, top level thing I'd want to emphasize, that you don't want to disconnect concern with markets from concern with these other issues. As regards who people might want to read, so this book, Markets Not Capitalism, is of course a product of a collaboration with Charles Johnson, who I wish were writing more. Charles has a variety of things going on that don't allow writing of this kind probably to be central as an activity for him, probably less so than it once was. But other people associated with the project that gave us the book, it seems to me are worth paying attention to, and certainly I would say the work of Roderick Long, philosopher at Auburn University, has been really, I think, profoundly insightful and clear and helpful in linking the 19th century radical liberal tradition with contemporary concerns on the left. So I think I'd certainly encourage people to look up Roderick's work, to look at praxeology.net. That's praxeology.net, his website, and certainly other people who've contributed to Markets Not Capitalism. The living authors there are all probably worth kind of chasing down. The other, of course, obvious person is Kevin Carson. Kevin, who at the time he contributed to that volume, I think would have called himself an individualist anarchist, now is inclined to say he's an anarchist without adjectives, and wouldn't himself probably want to endorse all of the pro-market stuff at this stage that some of the rest of us would. But I think reading Kevin ought to be very instructive for people. Just as a social analyst, I think he's very insightful, even when one cheers for developments perhaps in a somewhat different direction. So I think there's a list of people in that volume I'd encourage people to pay attention to, and there's quite a good bibliography to be had just by looking at the contributors list.
Unfortunately, Gary, that's all we've got time for today, so I'll have to finish on that one. Thank you very much for joining me, Professor Gary Chartier. Thank you very much.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.